The last of our panelists to speak to wrap up is going to address the question of what's the meaning of Apollo from the perspective of 50 years. And I can think of no better person to do that than Dr. Launius. Currently he runs Launius Historical Services, but before that he was my predecessor as Chief Historian at NASA, and the person who encouraged me to apply for a job at NASA, so thank you very much for that. And then moved on from NASA to an important job at the Smithsonian where he was Associate Director for many years. He's written over 30 books. I don't think he sleeps. And in fact published 2 this year on the Apollo program that are well worth your reading. So without further ado, Dr. Launius.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am Roger Launius. I have spent most of my time in Washington doing space history since 1990 when I first went to work for NASA, and then for a number of years at the National Air and Space Museum. I would echo Teasel's comment. If you have the chance while you are here, please go over and take a look. And beyond that, if you can get yourself to Dulles, go to the Udvar Hazy Center as well, where we've got an unbelievable collection of objects. So I think this is a very nice image to sort of start the presentation. And it has nothing to do with Apollo, except of course Buzz is there, and so is Jim Lovell, Sally Ride as well, looking up at the stars, and that's a very iconic sort of thing that I think we all do on occasion. So my colleagues have talked a little bit about some of the political issues associated with the Apollo program. I'm going to not dwell upon that, although I do have slides associated with that as well. But what I do want to do is make a shameless plug. I did publish a book earlier this year called Apollo's Legacy. It's perspectives on the moon landings, trying to wrestle with the question of what does it mean after 50 years. And there are chapters on all kinds of topics. But one of the things that came out of this was sort of angles of vision about how we think back on the Apollo program. And quite frankly, how it was thought of at the time as well. Overwhelmingly, our recollection is positive. And it is for those of us who are Americans especially, but even broader than that in the context of the world. We look upon this as a great triumph, and justifiably so. It was a remarkable experience to land on the moon. And for those of us who are old enough to remember it, it truly was a remarkable experience. And for those of you who are not old enough to remember it, I'd like to think that you're going to see us return to the moon, maybe go on to Mars or someplace else in your lifetimes. But it's not just the issue of American triumphalism and exceptionalism, which is a fundamental part of how we remember, recollect, and celebrate Apollo. There's also some counter-narratives, and they're less positive perhaps, but nonetheless they are important. The first one is sort of criticism from Apollo at the time and since from the American political left. It was, and I'll talk a little bit about more of this as we go through this, but that criticism was very real. It had points to be made. The same is true with criticism of it from the American political right, also then and since. And then finally, something that I truly enjoy jousting with people about, although maybe I shouldn't, is this cult of conspiracy that exists, that somehow there was this huge effort on the part probably of everybody in this room at some level to foist this landing on the moon, which they know did never happen. Now, I don't believe I need to take a show of hands in this particular room for, maybe I will. Everybody believe we landed on the moon? Yeah, okay. Otherwise, it might be a longer discussion. But nonetheless, we did. And it was a remarkable experience in so many ways. So I try to wrestle with that in this particular book. Okay, here endeth my plug for the book. We've already talked about the Kennedy decision to go to the moon. I don't need to revisit that necessarily. I will add one thing to what my colleagues have already said about this. It was obviously a hard-won decision, and the process of reaching it was one that was complex. And there was some trepidation, at least on the part of the president, about that decision as well. At the time that he gave the speech, he makes a comment not once but twice that he knows that this is going to be expensive. He knows that it's going to be hard to do. It's going to take a lot of time. And he thinks we should do it. But he then goes back to the Congress and he says, it is your responsibility, however, to decide whether or not we pursue this. And if you don't want to do it, basically tell me now. And let's not go down this road. Of course, Congress did very easily in 1961 approve the first budgets associated with bringing Apollo to fruition. But within just a couple of years, there's an attack on the NASA budget every year. It was not always popular. And that's an important thing to understand as well. We tend to lose that particular perspective as we think back on that. We sort of think that we marched through this process to reach the moon, and we successfully concluded it. So, and we've also talked about this, Apollo was a Cold War imperative. Without the Cold War, it would not have happened, maybe not at all, certainly not on the schedule that it was accomplished. There was lots of factors associated with that. Two of the international ones was Yuri Gagarin's flight, we've already talked about that, and of course the Bay of Pigs fiasco in which the Kennedy administration, a new administration with a young, handsome, aggressive president who many people at the time didn't necessarily think was up to the task. And he looks bad in the aftermath of the American-backed failure at the Bay of Pigs to overthrow Castro. There was a short window of opportunity to undertake this. It was, I believe, war by another means, in which nobody died, at least not intentionally. But it was also about demonstrating before the world that the future belongs to those forces who are a part of the Western alliance engaged in this Cold War struggle with the Soviet Union. And is the future going to be democratic and capitalist, or is it going to be something else? That's what is at stake here. And it's sometimes hard to fathom that. I deal with a lot of students, and they're 18, 19, 20 years old. They don't remember the Cold War at all. And how serious that was. Some of you in the audience who are as old as I am will remember this, how we would have duck and cover exercises when I was a kid, where we would crawl under our desk like that would protect us from a nuclear blast. I thought it was stupid when I was 10, it certainly was, but nonetheless, that was a very real fear. So we were going to demonstrate American technological and scientific prowess vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And as we all know, the future belongs to the people who can master science and technology. It did then, it does today. And John already made a comment to this effect, and I think it's absolutely true. In the aftermath of the Kennedy assassination, Apollo sort of became a protected entity because of a desire not and by the way, NASA would never get tired of using this if they needed to do so in the political arguments. You know, what do you mean you want to cut the NASA budget? You want to end the dying wish of our slain president? A little bit of an overstatement, but nonetheless, one that did sort of get the desired opinions. I don't need to walk through this. We all know this story. An 11-year program, roughly, although there was desires to do it before, and there were desires to continue it after. 6 successful landings, 3 circumlunar flights, 1 circumlunar flight, Apollo 13, intended as a landing mission, but of course they were not able to do that after the accident. But they did bring them home alive. And that, as much as the Apollo missions that were successful in landing and the Apollo 8 circumlunar flight really cemented in the public's mind worldwide the genius of Apollo and their ability of NASA to do pretty much whatever it sets about to try to do. A way which it was phrased to me one time by someone who is not a person who followed NASA. He said, you put an X in the solar system anywhere and NASA can land a spacecraft on it. A little bit of an overstatement, but who knows? Maybe it's more true than not. But that sense of success and capability was cemented by the Apollo efforts. And it was a demonstration of American exceptionalism. We love to think of ourselves as something different, and at some level, something better than the rest of the world. We're not really, of course, but that's certainly how we would like to think of ourselves. And so do people of other nations. It's not a thing that's just American. And Apollo is a great example of that, because it starts as a sort of shock to the system, as the Soviet Union is successful in demonstrating its Sputnik launches. The Americans could not do that at that time, the Yuri Gagarin flight, and a whole succession of other capabilities demonstrated in the first half of the 1960s that the Americans were sort of lagging behind. So there's this sense of a crisis, and then a recovery from that crisis, and then ultimately a successful capability. And it wasn't just Apollo 11. That was the first demonstration of it, but it was the rest of the program as well. I can remember going to the Soviet Union, or what was recently Russia, former Soviet Union, in the early 1990s, associated with some of the efforts to bring the Russian space program into the International Space Station effort, and talking to some of the engineers who were in the Russian program, in which they said, we were not convinced with the Apollo 11 landing that you guys had really won the race. How's that? Well, it might have been a fluke for one thing. Maybe they just got lucky. And maybe there would not be failures that would follow. And we really sort of changed our mind after Apollo 12, when they were able, within a short period of time thereafter, to land very close to a surveyor spacecraft. And that precision landing said, the Russians I was talking to said, well, we knew we weren't going to be able to do that. So that's an example of this particular issue. So this sort of exceptionalism is a very real and celebrated thing. We've seen a lot of that in the context of the anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing this last summer. It was obviously an early success. It was not sustainable. And there's a whole series of reasons for that into the 1970s. And a fundamental reason was the situation had changed. The world had shifted in the context of the 1960s. The circumstances that brought about the decision in which NASA was mandated to carry out the moon program, and they successfully did so, those situations had now changed. And the social environment of the 1960s had changed as well. And we're all familiar with the protests associated with the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Crusade, women's rights. I could go on and on. But there was a turmoil that existed in the latter part of the 1960s that Apollo did not address and could not address in spite of its fundamental success. So there are left-leaning criticisms of Apollo very early on, and they have existed right up to the present. And we've seen it in the context of our current space efforts. I will use simply one quote from Amitai Etzioni, who is here in this town. As emotional as it might sound, this is truly a question of investment in feeding starving children as against improving the maps of the Van Allen belts, of suppressing ignorance and disease on Earth as against finding new moons in the skies. And that's a representation of a liberal, left-leaning perspective that we saw in certain elements of the political environment of the 1960s and right up to today. There's also similar right-leaning criticisms of it at the time. My personal favorite is one by Dwight Eisenhower, who always thought Apollo was a bad idea. The moon race, as he said, has diverted a disproportionate share of our brain power and research facilities from equally significant problems, including education and automation. And he wrote memos, gave speeches, published articles all through the 1960s, and he lived to see the landing on the moon in 1969, that criticized these particular efforts. So those are two parts of the spectrum. They are minority positions, there's no question about it. But when we look back on Apollo, it is important to understand that not everybody is walking in with locked arms toward this particular successful conclusion of this effort. We've already talked about this at some level, the cost of undertaking Apollo. So this is a chart of the NASA budget as a percentage of the federal budget. So there's no absolute dollars associated with this. A couple of things about it I think are important. The first, on the left-hand side, that big spike at the beginning where you've got almost 4% of the federal budget going to NASA at the height of Apollo. That's the investment that took us to the moon. And as it plays out, the budget starts to go down. It gets down to below 1% of the federal budget in the mid-1970s, and it basically stays there ever since. It's now less than 1/2 of 1% of the federal budget. And if we're to return to the moon, we have to figure out how to do it within the confines of a budget profile that's similar to that 1/2 of 1%, even maybe slightly larger than that if Congress will act to provide that money. And if NASA can do that, everyone will cheer, because there is nothing but good feelings for NASA overall. And in the context of doing that, it might not all be NASA money. There could conceivably be international partners, maybe some corporate entities that would be engaged in certain parts of it and so forth, that would put dollars before this effort as well. But this is the challenge that one has to face in terms of moving forward with these kinds of missions in the future. The astronauts are the face of Apollo. They become it immediately. They are universally engaging. Some of them are exceptionally glib. Some of them are really funny. All of them are thought-provoking and provide I used this in a corporate event not long ago. They are the sales force that makes this a reality. And I see Buzz in the audience, and of course he was one of those people and did so much to convince the public that this was an activity that was worth doing. Now, some of the astronauts and some of the images may not be all that exciting, but I like the one on the upper left that shows the Mercury 7 in a survival training mode. They've been out in the desert for some period of time engaging in training activities and not looking all that great, but nonetheless they are the face of the program, and I would contend the astronaut corps remains the face of the human spaceflight effort today. And that's true in this setting as well. So here's Buzz again. And this, I took this particular photo while Buzz was at the National Air and Space Museum, and you can see him down in the center there, with an army of people, literally hundreds of people who had just bought his new book, and are standing in line to have it autographed and to say a few words to him as they pass by. That is a persistent thing. The celebrity status of the astronauts was incredible for the 1960s. It remains so right to the present. It was a demonstration of technological prowess, and that's what the intention was with the Apollo program. I talk about this in the book. I don't need to say much more about it in this context now, but the reality was that when they began the program, the people at NASA understood what would be required to be successful. They didn't have all of the decisions made, they didn't have all the technologies in hand, but they knew how to get there. And that's an area that was really significant for them. They did not have to create out of whole cloth new, entirely different things. And there was a lot of groundwork, some of which was done in all kinds of settings and literally around the globe, as it was marshaled to aid us to reach the moon. Except for a very few people, all of Apollo was about vicarious exploration. Those of us who were watching it on television or saw it a little more up close even, did not see what the astronauts saw, but the astronauts were able to depict it through images and descriptions and discussions of what happened on the moon, and it changed the nature of what we were doing. That visualization was really significant. It was significant in the context of showing the world how this was all going to take place and why it was taking place. And I've got about a half a dozen pictures here to suggest why that I think are significant in this context. The first is, and this should be a famous picture and everyone has seen it, the raising of the flag at Apollo 11 in 1969, Buzz Aldrin saluting the flag, and that photograph that went around the world and has been used in so many times and in so many places and in so many different circumstances since that time. But I would contend to you that its symbolism is significant because of what it says about our past. Every explorer, from the European expansion of the 15th century on, when they would reach a new land, would plant the flag of the sovereign they served. They would raise their sword to heaven, and then they would claim that territory for that particular nation. We went to the moon. We planted the American flag. There's no question about that. It was a great moment in history. But then, there's no claiming of the territory. In fact, the astronaut said, as depicted on the plaque, "We came in peace for all mankind." That particular juxtaposition of this activity with what had gone before was not lost on the rest of the world. And it was an understanding that this is a different time and a different circumstance, and the United States is going to do things in a different way, and presumably in a better way. I think that's a powerful image in so many different ways. The boot print on the moon, another image that Buzz took, a classic image. You obviously took several of these. I've seen one with your boot print there, and your boot. But what it symbolizes for me is something that I find fascinating, because since there is virtually no seismic activity on the moon, certainly there's no atmosphere, no wind, and none of those sorts of things, that particular print will be there for eons. And so when some creature from another body in another solar system somewhere else visits this particular place, they will see Buzz's boot print on the moon and know that somebody else had been there previously. And that is, unless we do something to disturb it ourselves, which is possible. I'm very concerned about preservation of sites on the moon. And I think we all should be, quite frankly. With the potential of return to the moon, and especially private sector activities in which they may want to go to those sites, I don't want to see a rover roll over that particular blueprint. And I certainly don't want to see anybody scuff it up. And we have a tendency to do that whenever we visit those kinds of sites. So, please take as a mission before you a way to try to support efforts to preserve the sites on the moon. I think it's important to do. I've already volunteered. NASA's not going to take me up on this. I've already volunteered to be the first curator on the moon. I will be glad to put up the ropes and stanchions around Tranquility Base for all the tourists who want to come. And someday tourists will come. There's no question about that. It's a question of when. And we need to preserve the sites for that purpose, if no other. But that particular image suggests the eons that will be passing, I would like to think, and other beings that may well see that. The Saturn V rocket launch, those of you who saw Saturn launch, and John Logsdon talked about being there at the time when the Apollo 11 launched, some of us have probably seen shuttle launches. I know I have, how moving an experience that is. Even though you're more than 3 miles away, you sort of see the engines light, but you don't hear anything yet, and then you hear this beating in your chest as that roar starts and the vehicle starts to lift off from the complex. I can only imagine how significant that was in the context of an Apollo launch, which I never saw except on television, and how powerful it is, and how it is essentially the kind of bomb load that you dropped in enormous settings of war under total human control. And the astronauts were able to fly this successfully to the moon every single time. Yes, there were glitches, but none of them were catastrophic. And that, in my mind, is a real demonstration of the technological success that Apollo engendered. And juxtapose that with the Soviet Union, who tried, but was never able to get their N-1 moon rocket to work properly. And that was the fundamental difference, quite frankly, in terms of American success and Soviet failure. Two other images that I'll point to, and some people have pointed to this in the past. This is the Earthrise image from Apollo 8. Everybody's seen it, everybody knows it. The moon in the foreground, gray and lifeless. The blue and white marble hanging in the blackness of space, and a realization that is impossible not to take to heart, that everything you know, everything you love, everything you hate, quite frankly, is on that little blue and white marble. And it is in itself a spaceship. And we better take care of it because there aren't any light bulbs. That realization of the Earth and its fragility is really significant in the context of Apollo. Some people have suggested that who would have thought that going to the moon would provide us with a new understanding and a new perspective on our own planet. But it really did, and so did this one. The whole Earth disk from Apollo 17, we've all seen this before as well, the only whole Earth image from the Apollo program, one that also suggests the same sorts of issues, and how we are essentially multitudes of people speaking different languages, having different nations, but nonetheless we are all living on this same little piece of the universe, and we need to take care of it. And then one of my personal favorite images, Buzz on the moon, the image that is iconic in so many settings. It literally moved around the globe, has been used in all kinds of settings right up to the present, and one that symbolizes better than almost any other how the humans who went there experienced this with their space suits on, bulky suits, hard to operate in, but nonetheless did an incredible job. And I can't not mention this. Obviously, it's the model for the MTV Video Music Awards as well. And those iconic images, and there's lots more beyond that, but I'm just talking about these today, really did allow us to experience exploration, not obviously in the same way that the astronauts did, but with enough commonality that we could make sense of it, and it resonated with us as a people. There's a couple of things about Apollo that are important to think about, and they are issues that are maybe less understandable for us, and certainly in our celebratory nature associated with the recently passed Apollo 11 anniversary. It really came to the fore in the 1960s how racially divided the United States was. Their civil rights crusade that sought to engage in all kinds of addressing of injustices, some successfully and some less successfully. Violence and assassinations associated with this, up to and including Dr. Martin Luther King in 1968. In 1969, at the time of the Apollo launch, Ralph Abernathy, the successor to Dr. King, led a Poor People's Campaign to the Apollo 11 launch site to Kennedy Space Center to protest the launch, not because he had anything against the astronauts or what the United States was engaging in the context of this environment, but because of what he viewed as misplaced priorities. You know, should we not be using these resources to feed the hungry, house the homeless, and so on? And those are valid questions, no question about that. And Tom Paine, who was the NASA administrator by this time, went to meet with Ralph Abernathy and the people on the campaign and talked to them about this. And he actually had a very positive and useful response in which he said, you know, if we could solve those problems by us not pushing the button to launch the astronauts to the moon, I would not push that button. But that's not the case. We have decided as a nation that this is a priority for us. It's one important priority. We're going to achieve that. But we will work with you, and NASA will be a part of efforts to try to resolve some of those challenges. And he recognized that it was harder to undertake remedies for social problems than it was defining a technological problem and resolving that. But he said NASA's got some capabilities and we may be able to help. And he did put efforts into a whole series of activities associated with helping the cities sort of deal with some of their problems. And some of those things have come to pass today and are used in that context as well. So that is an important part of the story that we must not forget. So the political cartoon on the left has an astronaut writing on a capsule that says U.S. space progress, and we are making progress. And then the horse and buggy with U.S. race progress, not making the same level of forwardness associated with it. And there's no question that that was the case. The other one, and this gets to the heart of the fact that all of the astronauts of the Apollo era were white men. There were some efforts to try to bring African Americans into that did not pan out, and there's a whole variety of reasons, which we can go into if you wish, associated with that. But at the end of the project, the Afro-American newspaper shows on the right-hand side astronauts standing on the moon, and two fellows, two African Americans down in the lower right, and says, well, maybe we'll go next time. If we go back, it is absolutely critical that the astronaut corps that is engaged in that effort needs to be reflective of the society as a whole. And it will be. I have no doubt about it. There's also a nostalgia associated with Apollo right up to the present. We see this emerge, especially in the 1990s. I think it reached its zenith at the time of the Apollo 13 movie in 1995, with Tom Hanks playing Jim Lovell. And how it suggested to us that we could accomplish things in the 1960s that we can't seem to do anymore. And that there was a sense that maybe we have declined a bit with our capabilities. I don't believe that's true, but there has been some people who have made that case. And they've looked back on that time of Apollo and said we were such a can-do people. And NASA was such a can-do agency. Why can't we do it again? That nostalgia is still present. There's a lot of issues associated with it, which we can discuss if you wish. And then finally, my personal favorite. Did we land on the moon? Absolutely. Anybody who doesn't think so is coming in about 3 or 4 different perspectives that are a part of this. Some folks were like my grandfather, who never believed we landed on the moon. Never, till the day he died in 1984. And his comment was, you know, those guys in Hollywood, they can fake anything. Not quite right, but okay, I got his point. But he's not a guy you want to listen to. He was a farmer his entire life in southern Illinois. He always farmed. Remember, he died in 1984. He always farmed with horses. Never had a tractor. His comment was, tractors are a passing fad. This is not a guy you want to listen to when it comes to talking and thinking about technology. And I think that there are those who are deniers of the moon landing, who are sort of in that category. They're a little unsophisticated when it comes to thinking about technology. There's a newspaper story from 1970, which is a woman who lived in Georgia, Macon, Georgia, said, I know for a fact we didn't land on the moon. And they asked her why. And she says, well, because I saw video of this happening on television. I can't even get pictures. I can't even get television from New York. How can we possibly get it from the moon? They had to have faked it. Again, another person whose understanding of the technology was not sophisticated enough to make sense of this. So those are one type of people. There are those who love the fact that they think they know something that nobody else knows. There are conspiracy theories for anything you can imagine. Americans love it. I think it's true elsewhere too. It's not just Americans. And some of it is sort of silly. The reporter for the New York Times, who's a science writer, walked into a bar in Chicago at the time of the Apollo 11 landing, and he says there was a bunch of these barflies sitting in there in the afternoon having a drink, and they were spouting about how they were doing all this at a Hollywood studio. Well, again, you don't want to listen to Cliff and Norm from Cheers talking about this kind of nonsense, because they don't know either. But the conspiracy theories, I think, actually energize some people, and they love to think, I know something you don't know, and here's why. I've been accused of being part of the conspiracy. Probably some of you have too. And the reality is, we know that that's not the case. But it tends to be persistent. And my concern, long term, is it tends to be growing a little bit in strength. And the longer time passes between the landings of 50 years ago now and the present, the more possibility exists that people will find it easier to say it didn't happen. We've seen that happen in other settings where things pass into the misty memory of the past, and you don't necessarily, you may not have the eyewitnesses anymore to sort of pull people up short when they try to say that. So the best thing that you do is go back, in my mind. Not that the diehards will believe you even then, but it's better than not. So one of the things, and Teasel said something about this earlier as well, and I just emphasize it for just a moment. Time to quit? Okay. Is sort of personal reflections on this. Regardless of anywhere you went in the world, there were people who were following this avidly. And it changed their lives in pretty fundamental ways. I love the story of a 7-year-old boy who was in San Juan who kept running outside to look at the moon to see if he could see the astronauts, and running back inside to see it on television being played out. And how exciting a moment that particular moment was. How Leroy Chow said, when I saw this, I decided right then and there, this is what I want to do. And of course he did. He became an astronaut. And Craig Ferguson, the comedian, late-night television host, who said, being an American is something I wanted to be since I saw the moon landings. So, we've got that going for us. Anyway, it made a lot of sense to a lot of people. It changed the nature of our international politics as it was intended to do. But it also changed a lot of people's perceptions of the United States and Americans and what it could and would be doing in the context of world history. So is there a meaning? Yeah, of course. I think 50 years after the fact, I think the first thing we need to understand is it demonstrated very effectively what it was intended to demonstrate, the American capability to accomplish this activity in the context of the Cold War. And it really was about beating the Russians. And that really was a race, too. They came late to the game, but it was a race. It solidified Cold War alliances, no question about that as well. It modeled that concept of we came in peace for all mankind. And I don't think that is something that we need to forget. I think it did inspire millions of people to pursue STEM types of educational activities. Virtually everybody who works in science and technology, who were alive at the time of the Apollo landings, will tell you that they were inspired by that. And they were. And that certainly helped to make them pursue those particular activities. Of course, I was inspired by it too, and I became a historian, so it didn't work out quite the same way for me, although I think I contributed a little bit over the years. It pushed science and technology in pretty fundamental ways. And one of the ways that I would like to point to, do I have 2 minutes? Okay. Is one that's a little bit harder to think of. People talk about spin-offs and things of that nature, and okay, that's fine. But there's things that are more subtle than that I think are ultimately more useful. So one of the things that happened is that the Stark Draper Lab got the contract to build an Apollo guidance computer. We all know that story. And they built it, and it had to be small, and it had to be light, and had to be fit into a certain space, and it had to have certain capability. And they assembled about 500 or so, the best people they could find to work on this particular problem. And they built a small computer that was light years beyond what existed at the time, and it did what it was supposed to do. Okay, so we all know that story. But then the program ends, and the people who were working on that contract disperse. And people who were working on other contracts associated with computing and anything else that you can think of at the end of the program, they disperse. But that group from the Draper Lab, they go all kinds of places. They go to universities, they go to think tanks, they go to industry, taking with them, I think I can say that in this audience and most of you will know what it means, taking with them the knowledge they had gained in the process and their Rolodexes. For those of you who are a little younger, that's essentially your contact list that's on your smartphone. In those days, it was literally a Rolodex. And they seeded the microelectronics industry in the 1970s. I don't think there's an accident that there's a flowering of this particular activity in the 1970s. It's not all due to Steve Jobs and people like that, although they made contributions. But this sort of activity really pushed this technology in fundamental ways. Now that's a more sophisticated story than me holding up a smartphone and saying I have more computing power in it than you had in the computer that went to the moon. All that's true. But I think this is a more compelling story. And this gets repeated over and over and over again, depending upon the technologies that are involved, as they seeded the rest of the world in terms of making this a reality. And so, in that sense, this is my final point. This set in place trends. Apollo set in place trends that helped to create our modern world in a pretty fundamental way. Anyway, thank you very much. I will end there.
I would ask you, while we invite the panelists to come back up to the front and have a seat up here so we can have the question and answer section, I'd ask you to join me in thanking our panelists once again.